was that there was a recent manifesto about we should be looking at things like this. Let me say two things, first of all. Actually, three things. Because the first thing is, there's never anything new in history. Much of what I'm doing comes from the work of agricultural historians. And I can refer to Dr. Lester, who is on the board of the Agricultural History Society, right? And so, in fact, when I started to do this work, I started this when I was a graduate student, and I can tell you the exact date, but that's not here or there. When I started doing this work, an agricultural historian approached me, who works on Latin America, and offered to share his data with me. His name is Robert Claxton. And he was specifically working on drought, and it's the mentoring of the older generation of historians who help, at that time, the younger generation. So Claxton's papers, by the way, are at the University of Florida. They're processing them right now. And so his lifetime of research will soon be available for anybody who wants to go up working on Latin. He specifically works on the Southern Cone and on drought in Chile and Argentina. But first of all, everything new is old, number one. Secondly, there is a recent book out by a man named Jeffrey Parker. It's about this thick. And it'll take you about 3 weeks to get through it, but it's an exceptional book. It came out, I think, in 2013. And he uses the idea of climate and climate cycles and climate change specifically to deal with the very cold 17th century. That's what he does. So thank you for your comment, but I can't take all the credit because this path has been, if not trod, it has at least been paved for this generation. Incidentally, the number of people who've worked on hurricanes in the Caribbean who've written books, the number is all the way up to 5. That's not very many. Compare the number of people who've worked on sugar in Cuba, which now are up to 5,000, but that's another story. So, other questions? Yes, Luis.
Thank you, Sherry, for a wonderful presentation. I have a couple of questions because some of my students who are history historians are here, and I think it's a good opportunity to sort of test some of the things that you presented. And I was particularly interested in the connection between climate and the Stonewall Rebellion.
Okay.
And I have a question about that. Before I pose that question, how much is it the actual climate event, and how much of it is how the authorities or those in power respond to those events? And then the other question is, well, those 20 individuals rose up.
I'm sorry?
The 20 slaves rose up in 1739.
Right, the Stonewall slaves, yeah.
What about the hundreds of thousands of slaves that didn't?
Yeah, good question. Okay, the first question was, is it climate or is it the authorities' response? And thank you for bringing that up. And the second is, what about the slaves who did not rise up? Did everybody hear that? Okay. Within the study of disasters of any kind, because again, this is the corollary, what I did not bring up because it would have made this presentation 2.5 hours long. The corollary to doing climate history is that we look for these disasters, the hyperbole, the big events that cause stuff. And we tend not to look at the ordinary everyday, hurricane hits and people go back to normal and that's it. And so people get used to certain conditions and they survive. And so this disaster studies run right along with the study of climate and extreme events. The problem, again, is that disaster studies don't just look at climate. Disaster studies do everything from war to earthquakes to tidal waves to everything else. And so we kind of have to pick and choose out of what they're doing in disaster studies and see if they're applicable to a historical study of climate. And so from disaster studies, and especially from political scientists spend a lot of time looking at how societies react to an extreme event. And they've come up with these ideas on how a population reacts or doesn't react. And in this case, that's where my argument about the political comes in, that in one place, because the government, they have specific rules that they can tell when, at what point in time is a government at the potential of collapsing because of the way they dealt with a disaster. The classic example that they use for Latin America is Somoza and the earthquake in Managua, and the way Somoza dealt with the disaster relief that he received. He, in fact, took millions of dollars from the United States and sold it all. Millions of dollars in relief and sold it, which was the breaking point. And so, in this case, I prioritize, I'm personally using the example of the chaos within the government, which is demonstrable in historical resources, to be able to show that things were not good. More sophisticated in the argument, in some of the sources, it shows that slaves kept escaping. The Mose people and the Stono people were not the only examples. There were other examples of slaves attempting to escape and actually escaping from Carolinas. Where did they go? Well, some were caught. We know that some were caught in Georgia and were returned to Carolina. Some went out into Indian territory. And the question of whether we'll ever be able to know whether they got there or not is a good question. I personally don't know. I can direct you to Catherine Braun's work, one of the premier scholars of indigenous issues in the 17th century. So that's why I'm limiting it to the political aspect. There are other economic aspects as well. In Carolina especially, we know, for example, that in the 1740s, the majority of rice cultivation was done in freshwater. By the 1760s, the freshwater had been affected by saltwater incursion, and so the planters had to turn to a different method of economic production. What did they do? They turned to importing a different regional group of slaves from Africa. It actually made a difference in human dynamics because slave traders would choose slaves from Africa who had experience in saltwater rice cultivation. And that is a domino effect like none other, that what happens in Carolina has importance to African history. And there's a good article on this, not on this specifically, but on the switch to saltwater rice cultivation in the Journal of African History right now. I have the citation if anyone wants it. What was the second question?
Those who did not revolt.
Those who did not revolt. Governments are smart, but people are smarter. And there are lots of examples about there are many examples about a catastrophic or extreme event causing a slave rebellion. Jamaica in 1776 is a really good example. But there is an inherent knowledge about when the time is right and when the time is not right. And for that, I would say we have to go back to the old-fashioned rebellion theory of the 1980s, when people, the Charles Tilley and Ted Gurr argument about when is the time, when will you succeed? So I can't answer that. And again, I would look at Peter Wood's Black Majority, and John Thornton did a subsequent article, and there's a third article on the Stoner Rebellion. But Wood and Thornton are, their interpretations are exactly the opposite. So, others? Okay, well, I thank everybody very much again. I thank UCF and the Department of History, and it's been truly an honor.